Hello and good afternoon. As part of the ongoing Moments and Movements programming, we as a firm continue to get together to discuss the impact of race on our society. As part of this programming, this is the first in a speaker series devoted to continuing these important discussions. I'm really pleased to give a warm, venerable welcome to our alum and one of our favorite alum, really a favorite of many of our lawyers for many years, the Honorable Judge Robert Wilkins. Welcome back to the firm to share the story behind the creation of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and other important issues related to race in America. I'll now turn it over to Claude Bailey, who's going to be moderating today's program on behalf of the Venable Success Network. Thank you.
Thank you, Stu. It's my pleasure today to be able to have this conversation with Robert and give him an opportunity to talk about the movement to create the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is a very important institution in Washington, D.C., not just in Washington, D.C., but in our country, but in our world, because I think more than any other place I've been, and I've been up to a lot of museums, it just so thoroughly captures the African-American experience in this country. One of the little known facts about the museum is that one of the main advocates for this museum from the very beginning was my friend, colleague, Robert Wilkins, Judge Robert Wilkins. As Stu indicated, Robert was a partner here at Venable. He left to become a judge on United States District Court for the District of Columbia. I think it was 2 years after that, if I'm correct, Robert, you were elevated to the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And he's done a great job since then, and he's done a lot. And the story about the museum is just fantastic. And I mean, the effort and the sacrifice that Robert undertook to make this happen it's unbelievable. And I think you hear a lot about that. And I mean, it's a wonderful place. And the good news is it just reopened, I think, last week or week before last. So if you have not been, I would urge you to go. And I think, as I tell people, I think every United States citizen needs to see this museum. It's just that fantastic. And honestly, it takes a while to see everything. You may have to go back more than once. I've been there at least 4 or 5 times. Still haven't seen everything, but it's a very fascinating place. I've even taken some of the summer associates on tours of the museum. And we only spend about half a day there, and we still don't see everything. But I hope that inspired them to go back and see more. So with that, I'm gonna turn this over to Robert and kind of let him talk about this experience, talk about the book. All of this is chronicled in Ronald in the long hard road to truth. Did I get that right? And
long road to hard truth.
Yeah, the long road to hard truth. Thank you, Robert. And it's a fact. I bought the book when Robert first had it published. Went to a couple of presentations he made about it, and that's a great book. If you haven't read it, I strongly urge you to read it because it is a fascinating story, and I think it's really a tribute to Robert and his commitment to see this happen. So, without further ado, Robert, I'm going to let you take over now and kind of start the story about this museum and how it all came about.
So thank you, Claude, and thank you, Stu, for your leadership and for endorsing this program and this series and for being a part of it. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to begin without giving also an acknowledgement to Moxie Upadhyay and Calvin Nelson, my first 2 law clerks who came to the district court with me from Venable and did such a wonderful job with me. and now went back home to Venable. So I became interested in working on the museum in the mid '90s, and it was while I was still with the Public Defender Service. And I think that I was motivated to get really involved with this effort out of frustration that I had from being a plaintiff in a racial profiling lawsuit against the Maryland State Police, where we were stopped and had our car searched by a drug-sniffing dog on the highway when we were returning from my grandfather's funeral in Chicago, and learned in the discovery process of the lawsuit that the Maryland State Police had a written policy to target blacks in rental cars from the DC area for drug searches. And so going through a process of litigating the denial of my constitutional rights and those of my other family members because of our race was exhausting, and it was also a very demoralizing process in many ways, especially as we saw even after we settled the case and thought that the Maryland State Police was going to change its ways with new policies and procedures, that the racial disparities continued because we, as part of our settlement, required them to keep data on who they were stopping and searching and what they were finding, et cetera. So I think between that experience and my experience as a public defender in DC, in seeing kind of mass incarceration on a daily basis, and also just seeing a lack of hope in my clients and in the lack of really kind of a sense of self of my clients, most of whom were African American, just made me want to work on something that was positive, that could be proactive, that could hopefully teach all of us as Americans more about the contributions of African Americans, but also kind of how did we get here as a nation. And so that's what motivated me to get involved. But the story of how this museum came to be goes back a long time before my involvement. It goes back over 100 years to the end of the Civil War, really. And I tell this is in my book, Long Road to Hard Truth, which you see there on the screen. Claude, can you just confirm with me that you see that okay?
I see it at the top. I don't see it on the screen. Let's see. Live, let me see, live view.
How about now?
No.
So I'm getting a message that everyone is able to see it.
Okay, push the audio. I see it. Yeah.
Okay.
People are seeing it. Yeah,
so
yeah, people are seeing it, right?
So I'll give you the more of the Reader's Digest version of the story. So at the end of the Civil War, there was a victory parade for the Union troops called the Grand Review of the Armies. And the image you see here on this slide shows that very parade. And DC shut down for 2 days to allow, I think it was about around 180,000 soldiers march from the Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue past the White House. And but there were no African American combat troops that were a part of that parade. even though African American soldiers had served, over 180,000 of them had served, and many believed that they helped turn the tide of the war. They were excluded. And what you see here is a marker from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because a few months after that, the official grand review, some organizers had a grand review for the U.S. colored troops because they had been excluded from the main party, and that was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And so that was, a nice affair, but of course it wasn't the same as being a part of the official review and being honored by the president and all of that. So you might ask yourselves, why would the black soldiers not have been invited to the grand review? The official explanation given was that it was just none were available. They couldn't find any who could, be spared to participate in the parade. You can read my book for the evidence that refutes that. Suffice it to say that there was a DC regiment. So, all they had to do was kind of go up the street to find some black soldiers. But at any rate, the official explanation was that none were available. My view is that the reason that they weren't included can be gleaned from this battle flag from the 24th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops. And it's hard to see, but across the top of the battle flag is a motto, and the motto is, "Let soldiers in war be citizens in peace." You see, the black soldiers were fighting not just to preserve the Union, but they were fighting to end slavery and to become citizens of the United States. And that was a very controversial proposition for much of the white community, including the then President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And so I think that it was likely that President Johnson and others were worried about validating the U.S. colored troops too much, because they didn't want to validate their view of their mission. So there you have it. That happens at the end of 1865, or the latter half of 1865. So let's fast forward 50 years to 1915, and it's the 50th anniversary of the Grand Review. And as you see on this slide from the New York Times, it's decided that they're going to repeat it in Washington and have those Union veterans come to Washington and participate in a reenactment of the Grand Review. This time, African-American Union veterans are invited to participate in this reenactment of the Grand Review. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it's the Jim Crow era, and so everything is to be segregated, and all of the official balls and banquets and things and receptions and tours are only for the white veterans, and a committee of African-American citizens called the Colored Citizens Committee is organized to raise money and figure out how to entertain the black veterans who are coming to town. So at any rate, here's an image from that 50th anniversary parade. And you see there aren't as many of the soldiers, and they're old, and many of them are walking with canes, and some of them can't even make the walk. They have to ride horses or in vehicles and that sort of thing. So, but at least many black veterans came, and they were entertained, and it was a great thing for them to get some recognition and to march past a presidential reviewing stand, which you see here, with then President Woodrow Wilson and other dignitaries saluting these Union veterans. The process was bittersweet because the movie Birth of a Nation was coming out at that same time in 1915, and the movie was taking the country by storm. And the essential argument of the movie, and it was based on a book by Thomas Dixon that celebrated the Ku Klux Klan. And basically the theme of the movie Birth of a Nation is that, the Civil War was this great tragedy, and enfranchising blacks was a disaster. And that the Klan needed to rise up and put blacks in their place and not let them vote, and lynch them when they get kind of out of their station. And when that happens, it'll be birth of a nation. The nation will be reborn as it should be. So that was the kind of the atmosphere in the country at the 50th anniversary of this grand review. And so the Colored Citizens Committee decided that they would not let this end without trying to find a way to permanently recognize the contributions of black soldiers. And so they decided to form a group called the National Memorial Association to build a permanent memorial to African-American soldiers. And you see here a flyer from one of their first meetings in May of 1916, and you see across the top the birth of a race, because they saw this really as a response to the slander of Birth of a Nation, and a way to make an argument in favor of African-American contribution and really African-American citizenship. There was a lot of opposition to this. They were able to find some supporters in Congress. A congressman from the St. Louis area named Leonidas Dyer introduced the first legislation in 1916. And he was also the first person in Congress to introduce anti-lynching legislation the same year. And I think that he and others saw these things as connected, because if you could help make the nation see that African-American achievement should be respected and honored, then perhaps the nation would be able to see that African-American people should be respected and should be able to enjoy all of their rights, including due process of law, instead of justice at the end of a rope. So they worked very hard, and within a couple of years, they expanded the scope to not just say, well, we don't just want some sort of memorial to soldiers. African Americans have contributed in the arts and in business and education and all these other endeavors. There really should be what they call the National Memorial Building to Negro Achievement and Contributions to America, and essentially an African American museum. And they envisioned that it would look something like this from the Washington Post. And so that's what they were pushing for. Despite lots of opposition, they were actually able to get legislation passed in Congress in 1929, and it was signed into law on President Calvin Coolidge's last day in office. But the only way that they were able to get it through Congress was after having all of the money stripped from the bill by the Southern Democrats. And so they were able to get authorization to create the money, the memorial building, but no seed money to do anything. And as you can imagine, That's the beginning of 1929. Well, 1929 wasn't a good time to begin a venture with no seed money because of the crash of the stock market in October and the beginning of the Great Depression. So this went nowhere. So let's fast forward to the 1960s, and you see an article here from the New York Times, and it's about a hearing on this effort in 1968. And James Baldwin is pictured because he testifies at that hearing in strong support of doing something like this. One of the things that he tells Congress is that my history tells the truth about America. It is going to be hard to teach it. And so I paraphrase Baldwin with the title of my book, Long Road to Hard Truth. So they have this hearing. Baldwin, Jackie Robinson, and others testify. And 17 days later, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and the country is thrown into turmoil. And basically, this project is kind of, shoved to the back burner. Where it stays in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in the 80s, Congressman Mickey Leland renews the efforts of this in Congress, and after he dies tragically in a plane crash, Congressman John Lewis, who is a freshman congressman just elected to the House in 1986, I believe, was his first term, he takes up the mantle for Mickey Leland. And there's a push to get the Smithsonian involved because the Smithsonian had not really been interested in doing this. And so you see in this article, Claudine Brown chaired an effort by the Smithsonian, and that committee found that the Smithsonian needed to create a new museum, and the Smithsonian adopted the recommendation of that committee and got on board finally after all of this time. And so, when I got involved with this around 1996 or 7, I went to see Congressman John Lewis because I understood that he was the leader of this in Congress and started working with him. And he was able to build a bipartisan coalition in favor of creating this museum. It had mainly been a priority for Democratic legislators, but he was able to get Senator Sam Brownback, Republican senator from Kansas, J.C. Watts, Republican House member from Oklahoma, and others involved with this. And you see them at a press conference in early 2001, along with then Senator John Edwards and then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. And Rick Santorum was there at this press conference, all of them in support of a bill to create this museum. They joked that you'll never see this cast of characters together in support of anything else probably ever, but we're all here in favor of this. And it looked like it was all going to sail through Congress. And I was congratulating Congressman Lewis after this press conference. And we thought that we'd have a bill passed and ready for President Bush to sign within months. But this is May of 2001, and in September, namely September 11th of 2001, of course, the nation is under attack, and that puts the museum on the back burner as Congress's attentions are turned to war and Osama bin Laden and the Patriot Act and various other things. But this bipartisan coalition does agree to a compromise, which is to create a presidential commission to plan how to move forward with this museum project. And I was appointed to serve on that commission at the recommendation of Congressman Lewis. And that is around the time that I actually joined Venable. And Venable supported my efforts to work on this pro bono while I was practicing with the firm. And you see this photo of that presidential commission at one of our meetings. You might recognize in the front, third from the right, Cicely Tyson, the actress. She was on the commission. And you might recognize in the back, fourth from the I said third from the right, I meant third from the left for Cicely Tyson, and fourth from the right is Hank Aaron, the Baseball Hall of Famer and my childhood hero, was on this commission. And we met and delivered a report to Congress, which passed the House. I think the vote was something like 408 to 9, and by unanimous consent in the Senate. And here is President George W. Bush signing it into law in the end of 2003. And I got the honor of standing right behind him as he's signing that into law. And 13 years later, September 24th, 2016, the museum opens. And that's a picture from the dedication ceremony. So we just celebrated the 4-year anniversary of the museum last week. And here's an image from the dedication ceremony, and Barack Obama is now president. And you see President Bush and Mrs. Bush sitting there along with then First Lady Michelle Robinson Obama, along with Lonnie Bunch and Congressman Lewis there on the dais. But I just want to, and you see Congressman Lewis and President Obama embrace during that ceremony. So I just wanted to show this image of the parade. Can you all see this?
I can. I can't speak for anyone else.
I got the message that the slides weren't advancing. I'm not sure what was happening there, but there's an image of the inauguration parade of President Obama, and just think about kind of the progression of the country in terms of these 3 parades. The first parade at the end of the Civil War, where they excluded black soldiers completely. The second parade 50 years later in 1915, where black soldiers were invited. But they are, it's a Jim Crow. And I'm getting messages still that people can't see the slides. I don't know if the technical people can tell me what needs to happen to make them be able to see the slides. I'm doing everything that I can on my end. But you go from not being invited to the parade and hit something on the keyboard. Did that help? Can the AV people just tell me whether that worked for the slides to be able to be viewed? But my point is that you can kind of see the progression of our nation with respect to African American citizenship in terms of those 3 parades, from total exclusion to Jim Crow to the commander-in-chief and president of the United States being honored with a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. And interestingly enough, John Lewis plays a pivotal role in both the museum and you could say also in President Obama's election through his work to secure civil rights and importantly voting rights for the African American community. So that's a very important part of Congressman Lewis's legacy. And so this next slide that I'm showing is kind of really sums up the bipartisan spirit that went into the creation of this institution that I think is so important for this nation and that I hope that we can return to because that's how you get important things like this done. And so that's really the sum and substance of the story of how this museum came to be.
What role do you think the museum can play in this current discussion about the elimination of systemic racism?
Well, I think that a museum, the museum isn't going to be a panacea by any means, but I think that it can help us understand how we got here. And I think that if we can better understand that and get to some sort of common understanding about that, we can move forward. I'm told that it may be a problem with people's internet browsers blocking the slides. So I'm not sure how people can fix those settings, but I think that some people can see them and some can't. But I think that I've done everything I can on this end so that you can see them. But yeah, so I think that the museum can help us reach some sort of common understanding, and then from that can be a springboard to, thinking about and talking about how to move forward. The museum, I think, has been, a great way to educate all of us about this history, and it's been, very popular. It was among the most popular of all the Smithsonian museums, I think second only to the Air and Space Museum, or perhaps third, because I think maybe natural history got more visitors at its peak. But I think it's also been a safe space to be able to discuss these complicated issues of race. And they've held a lot of forums there, panel discussions and, movie screenings and other things to kind of help people contextualize all of this. And so I'm hopeful that the museum, will be able to continue to play that role.
I'd like to open it up to the audience. I think if you have questions, I think there's a box. I think you can enter your question in. Does anyone want to pose a question?
And I also, if we have time, Claude, wanted to talk about kind of my further thinking on this subject. That's the subject of my next book.
Yeah, that's what I was going to segue into that. Okay, we do have one question. What do you think are the most important issues facing the Black community to address those issues?
I hesitate to offer my own prescriptions to those things. I'll leave that to the politicians and policymakers and community leaders. I'm just a little old judge deciding cases and controversies that come before me. But obviously the issues of poverty, the issues of educational parity and access, and economic opportunity are issues that we've been dealing with, for decades and decades, and I don't think have left us. But I don't know that I'm, qualified or in the best position to talk about what the solutions are. But obviously, I feel very strongly that we all need to be concerned about those issues and working towards those solutions. I see another question of what is the most meaningful artifact in the museum. And to me, there's so many things that are very meaningful, but to me, I think what moved me the most was there's a slave auction block that I think was taken from a courthouse in Virginia, and just seeing that and knowing that people had to stand on that so that they could be seen by the crowd who was going to bid on them to purchase them, and that babies and toddlers were probably pulled from their mother's arms on that auction block because they were being sold separately from their mothers in various instances. I think that just kind of thinking about what that represents and the tragedy and the horrors that occurred with that auction block is something that haunts me every time that I see it in the museum.
Right. And a related question was, how did the museum acquire a lot of the exhibits and things that are in there? And I know from what I've read, a lot of stuff was donated by people. People were just so happy to know this museum existed that they were kind of swamped with people wanting to give them things that they thought should be displayed in the museum. As I understand it, they got a big warehouse of stuff they haven't even displayed yet because they got so much stuff from people.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they did something kind of akin to an antiques roadshow where they would go around and people would just bring things in, and then people also would hear about the museum and just call them up out of the blue. And that's how they got Nat Turner's Bible. Was a woman just called them up and said, "I have Nat Turner's Bible. Do you want it?" And then some things, they raised money and they acquired from collectors. And so it was really a combination of a lot of different ways, but they were successful in putting together a really magnificent collection. Lonnie Bunch, the founding director of the museum, and his staff just did a masterful job with everything, soup to nuts, on this museum.
I'm going to try now to give you an opportunity, given the little time we have left, to talk about your new project and what you're doing and why you think it's important. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
So thank you. So I was inspired a couple of years ago to think about what I could write to try to pay tribute to the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that ended slavery, that established that African Americans and all those born in the United States were citizens and entitled to equal protection of the law, and the 15th Amendment that establish the right to vote, at least for African American men. And because I didn't really feel that relative to the impact that those amendments had on our nation, that they were getting enough recognition on the 150th anniversary of their ratifications. And so I started thinking about how I could do that and how I could marry that with my interest in genealogy. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this book. So let me just walk you through kind of the core of the story, and then you can take any question. This slide here is a picture from a family Bible that had been passed down from generation to generation to my grandmother, and she gave these pages from it to me. But they have entries of births and deaths, and marriages. And this page here shows my great-great-great-grandfather's birth. On the first line, Lewis R. Salisbury, born on September 25th, I believe it is, 1842. And that was the earliest ancestor of mine that I could identify, my grandmother's great-grandfather. And for 30 years, I struggled to try to figure out who his parents were and what I could find out about them. And I don't have time to tell you how I did it, but I was able to, after lots of looking and some assistance from some family members, find records, including this record. And it is a record that documents the disposition of the slaves that belonged to a man named David Robertson. So he died, and the probate court had to decide how to divide up his slaves. And I know it's hard for you to see this, but it says, I've got underlined, to divide the Negroes amongst the heirs of David Robertson. And then you see about halfway down that a man named Anselm Bell is to have Edie, a woman of color, 17 years old, valued at $350. Edie was Lewis Richard Salisbury's mother and my great-great-great-grandmother. And so this document shows that she is being given to basically the son-in-law of David Robertson. So his Robertson's daughter had married this man, Anselm Bell. You see further down under entry number 4 that a boy named Alexander, who was 1 1/4 years old, valued at $125, was given to a different daughter of David Robertson, Isaphine Robertson. And that Alexander, that toddler, who was just barely kind of on solid food, was Edie's son. And he was a mixed race child. His father was a white man. I don't know who. Edie was, 17 years old then. So at 16 or 15, she was impregnated by a white man. And we can imagine what the circumstances of that were, but it was probably not of her choosing. And her son was being given away to somebody else. So she has the indignity of being raped and then having the son that she bears being torn away from her. And then you see at the bottom, there's an entry where Margaret Robertson is giving a woman named Hannah, a woman 38 years old. And I can't prove it for sure, but I believe, and other family members believe, that Hannah is likely Edie's mother, which would make her my fifth great-grandmother. But Hannah was given to a different daughter, and that daughter would marry and move to Arkansas, and Edie probably never saw her again after that. So this one document kind of demonstrates the horrors of slavery, the rape, the separation of families, and basically the lack of any sort of agency or control over your own life and freedom. So what we know is that Edie, a few years later, is sold to a man named Thomas Salisbury to settle a debt. And Salisbury allows her to marry. These marriages aren't recognized by law, but he allows her to marry another slave named David, who is owned by a neighboring farmer, white farmer. And together, Edie and David have about 12 children who are all owned by Salisbury, since he owns her, and the law makes him the owner, therefore, of her children, since she's his slave. Salisbury and his wife, Rebecca, do not have any children between them, and so Thomas Salisbury has no legal heirs. And he writes a will in 1844 in which he decides to free all of his slaves, essentially, after he's dead and after his wife is dead, and after they reach the age of 25. And this is his will that he wrote in 1844, a copy of it. And I underlined there near the top my will and testament. And then kind of midway through the page, he says, my slaves, he had written a will previously saying that it was his will for his slaves to be free at the decease of myself and my wife. And then he says at the bottom of the page that he thought that it may not have been the wisest provision for his younger slaves. And so he was revising his will to say that the slaves that were under 25 should be given to his friend and a lawyer named Edward Rumsey. And then at 25, Rumsey was to free them. And if you look here, this next slide, there is this is a page further in the will, and he talks about how he's bequeathing to Edward Rumsey these slaves that are under 25. And then if you look at the bottom of the page, he is itemizing them and naming them. And he names, in what's underlined there, Lewis Richardson, born September 25th, 1842. So the same birth date that's in the family Bible that my grandmother had and gave to me is in the birth date for this Lewis Richard that is in Thomas Salisbury's will. And so what happens is that Thomas Salisbury dies in 1848, and then his wife dies in 1860. And so, you would think, well, great. Now the slaves that are over the age of 25 can be free. Salisbury said that all of his land, which comprised about 550 acres, was to be divided up among the slaves, his former slaves. And so, great, they're free, they've got this land, and the ones that aren't 25 yet, can look forward to their freedom once they reach that age. But there's a problem. A big problem, and the problem is that in 1850, Kentucky amended its state constitution to say that a slave master could emancipate his slaves, but the only way for them to be free is if they left the state. Kentucky did not want free blacks in the state. And if they remained, the Constitution said that it would be a felony for them to remain, and they would be essentially re-enslaved. So Edie, by law, was going to have to leave the state. And where would she go? Well, the two closest states north of where she was in western Kentucky were Illinois and Indiana. And they had similarly amended their state constitutions around 1851 to say that free blacks could not immigrate into their states, and it was a crime for them to do so. They didn't want free blacks either. Most of the country, whether it was slave states or free states, had a prohibition on free blacks coming into the area. So here was Edie with her 12 children with nowhere to go. She could stay in Kentucky, but then she would, kind of give up her right to be free and the right of her children to be free. She could try to leave, but she'd have to figure out where to go, and she'd have to leave her husband behind because he was owned by someone else and was not freed in this will. So she had a real dilemma. But she does something that all of you would recognize and appreciate. She hires a lawyer, and she sues in Muhlenberg County Circuit Court there in Kentucky. And she says, I want to do three things. I want to stay here, I want to inherit my fair share of this land, and I want to be free. And her lawsuit is right there where I have a bookmark in this box in the Kentucky State Archives. That's the actual lawsuit. That's what it looks like now and how it's stored. Almost over 150 years later. And this is a scanned copy from that lawsuit. And you see I've circled her name because she's the lead plaintiff. The administrator of the Thomas Salisbury estate, and then the first named plaintiff is Edie, and then there are the names of the other Salisbury slaves there, and including Lewis Richard that I have circled. So her lawsuit says, this will was written in 1844. My former master died in 1848, and the will was published then. And you didn't amend the Kentucky Constitution until 1850. So that amendment should not apply to me and the other slaves. We're grandfathered. And so the case went into litigation for a couple of years. And in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, this court order here was entered, and this is a copy of the actual court order, and she wins. And the judge writes there, and what's underlined, I know it's hard to read, that he judges and decrees that the slaves in the petition are entitled to their freedom. And because the will was written before the present Constitution, And so they do have a right to remain in Kentucky and are not compelled by law to leave the state. And so something called the Salisbury Free Negro Settlement was born. And so, so perhaps I came by my litigious nature honestly, and got it from my fourth great grandmother. But what this story tells is not just a personal story. It's a story of a woman who, under our Constitution, was not even considered a person. She was not part of we the people that were creating the more perfect union per the Constitution. She was considered to be one of the other persons that would be counted as 3/5 of a person only for the purpose of enumerating members of the House of Representatives, but not as somebody with any rights. And indeed, 3 years before Edie filed her lawsuit in 1857, the Supreme Court had made clear in the Dred Scott decision that people of African descent had no rights that any white man was bound to respect, and that they were completely outside of the U.S. Constitution. And so Edie may have been free, but she wasn't even a citizen of the United States by this court order. And her husband, David, wasn't even free because he wasn't affected by this will or this court order. He would only be freed after the Civil War and after the enactment of the 13th Amendment. And she and David wouldn't be citizens until the 14th Amendment was enacted. After the 13th Amendment was passed, Kentucky amended their marriage law, and you see it here, February 16th, 1866, to provide that Negroes and mulattoes could marry, and that the counties and states should keep separate records of those Negro marriages. And I found those records, and here is the record from Muhlenberg County, and the 12th marriage that was recognized under this new law was David Salisbury and Ida Salisbury, who came to solemnize their union and say that they had been living together as husband and wife and want to continue to do so under the law. And so on March the 24th or 29th of 1866, so just a month over after that law was passed, they went down to the court to take advantage of this new law to be recognized as husband and wife. So in many ways, they were trying to, take advantage of the protection and the rights that the law gave them. And I think that their story helps us understand, that quest by all African Americans for full citizenship. And so that's my next book. This is my last book, Long Road to Hard Truth. Hopefully next year I'll be able to talk about my next book. So I know we are kind of at the end of our time, Claude, but I'm happy to answer any other questions or respond to any of your reactions.
Right.
We have a question from Moxie, Robert, and she wanted to know how was John Lewis able to get this bipartisan support for the museum? Maybe it was a different time then. Maybe things weren't as partisan as they are now. But I think she kind of wanted to know how that came about.
So I think that that it was a variety of things. I think that he had worked well with J.C. Watts on some prior legislation, kind of reaching across the aisle, and they had mutual respect for each other. And so when Congressman Lewis went to J.C. Watts to talk to him about this, because he was a new member of Congress at that time, relatively new, Congressman Watts was receptive. Senator Brownback was interested in this issue because he, in the Senate, was involved with kind of contemporary human trafficking issues, and he just felt that slavery in this country was something that had not really been addressed properly, and so he went to Congressman Lewis to talk about that, and Congressman Lewis said, well, one way we could try to talk about it and address it is with this museum. And so Senator Brownback came aboard. And President Bush heard about it and got interested and dispatched Vice President Cheney in his capacity as president of the Senate to go talk to the Republican senators. And Vice President Cheney made clear to them that this was a priority for President Bush. And I think that helped get many of them on board if they weren't inclined to be on board previously. And so they just really built this coalition. And I think that they worked very hard to portray this as not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, but just as something that needed to be done for the good of the country. And they worked very hard to kind of share, the credit for it, so that no one felt excluded, and it was really beautiful to watch it all play out, because there was really, I think, a sincere effort to make this, above politics, as something that needed to be done for the good of the nation.
Right. I want to answer a question our good friend Jackie Botash has asked about the structure of the museum. If you haven't been there. The museum is, I want to say, 4 floors. The very first floor, it's kind of by theme. The very first floor is really the early history of African Americans coming to this country and African Americans under slavery. Then you kind of walk up and you kind of see the history progress. You see history progress, and then you see stuff about the Civil War. You see things about Reconstruction. And when you get to the upper floors, it's more about sports, culture, music, those kinds of things. That's the top floor. But it takes, as I said before, it takes a long time to go. But I recommend everybody start on the first floor and work your way up. I mean, I think that's the way it was designed, so that you can kind of see chronologically, see the history, see the African American history chronologically. If you start from the first floor and work your way up, if that answers your question, Jackie. Yeah. And then Laura Sandifer asked an interesting question: how do we influence our school systems to provide more robust education around the African American story and history? I think that requires people to lobby their school boards and and make them understand how important it is that this become a part of the curriculum of all schools. Because I think we have seen that to the extent that there's not much African-American history taught, and to the extent it is taught, there's a lot that isn't taught. There's a lot more that can be taught. But I think you have to kind of press your elected officials, and particularly school boards and the people that run the school systems to do a better job of providing for a more robust curriculum around African-American history. I hope that answers your question.
And the museum does have a lot of curricular materials that they have created that, schools or, parent groups or whoever can take advantage of.
Right.
I saw that I have another question about where did I start to trace back my family tree? I mean, I got interested in this during law school, so over 30 years ago. And a friend in law school was very heavily involved with genealogical research. And so she, kind of told me how to do it and how she did it. And she recommended it. I began by, talking to, the older relatives and find out like what they knew and what records and documents that they had, et cetera. And then from there, go on to the National Archives and other places where I could find old census records and other things. And back then, this was the late 80s, there wasn't the internet, all these things weren't online, so you had to actually physically go to these places and dig through files, and, it took a lot of time and shoe leather to do this. But that's when I started this effort, was over 30 years ago. And that's when I got those Bible pages from my grandmother, and it took me, almost 30 years to make the breakthrough that I did, to figure out who the parents were of Lewis Richard Salisbury, and to learn about this story of the lawsuit and this inheritance from their former slave master, because my grandmother didn't know anything about it, and no one in my family knew anything about that story. And so it was almost lost to history, but luckily I was able to stumble upon it in my research.
Right. One thing I do want to point out, Robert, is being the modest person he is, I don't think, really do justice to his role in the creation of the museum, because I know for a fact that he actually quit his job at the Public Defender Service and spent full time unpaid for 2 years or so pursuing this. Is that fair to say?
About a year and a half. If it had lasted 2 years, they would have foreclosed on my house. But yeah. But yeah, I talked my wife into letting me quit my job at the Public Defender Service, and she was. We had one child under 2 and another one on the way, and she was 7 months pregnant with our second child when I had the bright idea to quit my job and work on this museum effort full time with no salary, but with the hope that I was going to get a grant from the DC government to help us. We had gotten a letter of intent to give us this grant, the nonprofit that I had started, but the DC government never came through with the money. So we had to kind of scrape by for a year and a half while I worked on this. But that was during the time that Congress, created the bipartisan coalition came into effect, and created that presidential commission.
Let me see if you have any other questions. If not, I don't want to keep people. We've run over. And another thing I want to mention is, and I did not say at the beginning, this event was brought to you by, obviously by Venable It was the Very Special Network, or VSN, the affinity group of the African American lawyers were also sponsors. And we also want to thank our sponsors from the co-sponsors from the Washington Bar Association, which is the African American Bar Association in this in the District of Columbia. Like most things, it was formed when African American lawyers could not join the White Bar Association, and they formed the Washington Bar Association. In fact, last year, Robert was given the Charles Hamilton Houston Award of Merit by the Washington Bar Association, which is his highest honor. So I do want to thank the Washington Bar. Tony Towns, the current president of the Washington Bar Association, had a family emergency and could not be with us at the last minute, but it was planned for him to make some opening remarks before the program started. So we do want to thank the Washington Bar Association for being a co-sponsor. So I think with that, Judge, we want to thank you for your time. It's very interesting. I hope your presentation piqued people's interest about the museum who have not been there. Like I said, I've been there 4 or 5 times. It has reopened. They now have time tickets. Some interest was expressed in perhaps a venable trip to the museum. If people are interested in going, please contact me, and I will try to arrange maybe one day we could all go as a group. I think it would be good. I think it would be good to go as a group and then have a conversation about the trip afterward. I think that would be very, 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 very enlightening and great as well. And I think it would be in the spirit of the dialogue the firm is currently engaged in around issues of race. So with that, Robert, I want to thank you again. I want to thank firm chairman Stu Ingus for his opening remarks and for his constant support of all the diversity efforts that are going on in the firm. And with that, I guess we can bid everyone adieu. And if you have questions that you feel you didn't get answered, you'd like to get answered, just let me know. And either I can answer them, or I'll see that Robert can get you an answer to your question if there was a question you just have a burning desire to get an answer to. So with that, thank you all. And everyone, please have a good evening and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claude. And thanks to the Washington Bar Association and the Venable for this opportunity. And it was great to be with you, even virtually. But take care, everyone.
Thank you.